Hey everyone, for the lesson today, I want to talk a little bit about atmospheric perspective. And what that means is we're going to be using value, and you know what value is now. We've talked about it several times in this class, using light and dark variations of a color to show depth in our work. So in the bottom left corner, you can see a couple examples of this in a painting style. You may have even done a painting like this before. And in the right corner, you can see a photograph that has a great example of how this actually happens in real life and how value shifts to create a sense of depth. So before I talk about atmospheric perspective, I want to compare this to one-point perspective. You maybe have done some artwork before using one-point perspective. In one-point perspective, what you have is a horizon line. So that would be this line right here, and that separates the sky, which is above, and the ground, which is below, right? We often have a horizon line using one-point perspective. We also have it when we use atmospheric perspective. The difference is in one-point perspective, you have a point on that horizon line called the vanishing point, and then all other lines lead to that point. So for example, you may have done a picture like this one on the right before, where you have a railroad track, and the lines on the right side all lead to that vanishing point. On the left, they all lead to the vanishing point. You might have telephone poles that as they go back in space, they get shorter and shorter and shorter. And again, this is the idea here is we're creating that illusion of space on a flat surface. The same thing is happening over here, not with a railroad track, but with a road. So again, we have our horizon line here, going to our vanishing point. We have our road, which has two lines. Again, as we go back in space, you'll see they get closer and closer together. And then those trees are getting smaller and closer together. So this is called one-point perspective, and it uses a vanishing point. We are not talking about that today, but I did want to point that out in case you've heard of this before. So what we're talking about is atmospheric perspective. When you have atmospheric perspective, that means we don't have any straight lines in our composition. We don't have any roads. We don't have any railroad tracks. And so what we use is value, a shift of value specifically to show depth. So for example, this photograph right here, you'll notice the colors that are up close. And the trees, like this tree is pretty close to us. These trees are pretty close to us. You'll see these are the brightest greens. And then as we move back in space, these are a little bit further away. We get into like a darker, more faded green, and then even further away and further away, it becomes almost into a grayscale where it gets lighter and lighter and lighter. You see the same exact thing happening in this photograph over here. That red ball that is closest to us is the brightest, most vibrant red. And then as we move back in space, they do get smaller and smaller. They also get higher on the page, but most importantly, the color is fading. So if you were taking a photograph and you had a stop sign right in front of you, say right here, and then you had a stop sign a half mile down the road, that stop sign a half mile down the road is not going to have a red that is as vibrant as the one that is up close to us. So this is an example of how you can use value to create, again, that illusion of depth in your artwork. So here's that same photograph from the first slide. I want you to take a moment and just do that critical thinking. Use that really observational eye that you've developed in this class. Where do you see a transition of value? Meaning, where do you see a color that is maybe a little bit more vibrant, or maybe even sometimes we call it darker, and then it getting lighter and lighter and fading? A couple places you might notice is in the sky. We have a nice vibrant orange right here. And then as we move up in space in that sky, it's getting lighter and lighter and lighter. Same within these trees, we have these vibrant greens. In fact, the most vibrant green is really down here in this green grass that's closest to us. It's still pretty vibrant here. And then as we go back in space, it gets more faded, and then into these blues and getting lighter and lighter. So again, paying attention to where we see those brighter and vibrant colors and where we see those more muted and faded colors. Noticing things like this is what is going to help you make your drawings and paintings look more realistic when you're trying to create that sense of depth. As we talked about when we were talking about value using graphite a few weeks ago, If you only color something in one color, it makes it flat. So for example, if the sky up here was all shaded in the same shade of orange, this vibrant orange, if that was all the same shade of orange, this sky would look very, very flat. If all of the trees here were the same color as the trees back here, it would make it feel like they're on the same plane. Part would not look as far away as this one. So having that shift in value makes a huge difference in your work. This photograph is the same thing. I'm just going to give you 30 seconds or so here to look at this photograph. Pay attention to where do you see the brightest greens and the highest one of contrast as well. You might notice in a tree like this, we have dark green shadows here, but then we also have these light green highlights on the leaves as well. But when we look back at the trees back here, we don't see such a shift. We don't see those dark greens and bright highlights quite as much because these are further away. They're a little bit more muted. And then especially when you get back in here, the shift in values between these greens is really minimal. And then when you get all the way back here, it's almost really the same color of blue-green. And then the same with back here, there's just a slight shift in value in the background. I've got one last one to show you. This has a really nice example also of a value scale happening. It's pretty subtle in the sky. If you're not using your critical eye, you might think to yourself, oh, well, that sky is all blue, right? But if you look closely, this sky is closest to us. It's right above our heads pretty much. And then further away down here on the horizon line, do you see how this blue is getting lighter and lighter? It's a very slight shift, but this blue right here on the horizon is lighter than it is up here. Getting that difference in blue when you paint is going to make your sky look more three-dimensional and like this is further away and this is closer to us. Same with the blue in the water. Not all these blues are the same. So you have a blue that's a little bit darker in the background and it's getting kind of more vibrant into this blue-green water as it gets closer and closer to us. So just a few more details about atmospheric perspective. Keep in mind, things that are far away, if you want something to look like it's farther away from you on a page, it's going to be smaller. So for example, tiny little trees back here, they're also higher up on the page. They have more dull colors or low contrast, as we talked about. They're also going to be less detailed. You might have soft or fuzzy edges on things, and sometimes they'll be partially visible because they may be overlapped. So for example, these trees back here in our background, they're smaller than the trees in here. They're up higher on the page. Again, these greens are a little bit softer, have less contrast, and they're overlapping each other. In comparison, these things in here are in our foreground. They're a lot larger. They're low on the page down here. You'll see that there's brighter colors and higher contrast happening. So like the highlights and the shadows in these rocks or in these bushes or things like that is a lot different than the highlights and shadows that we might see over here, or especially back in here. We barely see any highlights or shadows. All of your detail work is going to be in your foreground, and these things are all fully visible, meaning that they're not overlapped. So for today in class, we are going to be creating this image as a painting. This is only going to be a reference. The blues or greens that you use for the sky or for the water or even for the mountains might be different than what you see in this photograph, but this is going to be our reference image, and this is going to be the drawing that you are going to create. So if you're doing this work right now, not with class, and you're just watching this video, pause right now, take a piece of paper in your sketchbook, fold it in half, and then cut across so you have a half sheet of paper, and then I want you to draw this image on that paper, and then we will be painting together to create some depth in this image.